The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the kitchen as I adjusted the vase of flowers on the dining table. It was a Saturday morning, one of those rare moments where everything felt calm. My husband Dan was already out playing golf with his friends, the ritual he never missed, no matter how busy life got. I envied his freedom sometimes, the way he could just step away from it all without a second thought. I had 100 things on my to-do list, but today I chose to slow down. That was until my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, my best friend. "Can you keep an eye on Jake this afternoon? We're leaving earlier for the weekend. I owe you big time." Jake. Her son, my godson. He was 20 now, home from college for the summer. I smiled at the thought of him, how he'd grown from an awkward teen into a confident young man. Of course, I didn't mind helping Lisa out. She and I had been inseparable since college, through marriage, kids, and all the ups and downs life had thrown at us. I texted her back, "Of course, have a great trip. Tell Mark I said hi." By the time Jake arrived, I'd already settled on the couch with a book, trying to soak in the last few minutes of solitude. The knock on the door startled me. I opened it to find him standing there, backpack slung over one shoulder, a grin plastered across his face. "Thanks for letting me hang out here," he said, stepping inside. "Mom and Dad left in such a rush I barely had time to pack." "No problem at all," I replied, closing the door behind him. "You hungry? I was just about to make lunch." Jake followed me into the kitchen, his presence filling the space in a way that was hard to ignore. He'd grown taller since the last time I saw him, his frame more defined, his boyish features now sharp and mature. It was strange seeing him like this, no longer the gangly kid who used to tag along to family barbecues, but a man who carried himself with a confidence that was both surprising and unsettling. We chatted as I prepared sandwiches, catching up on his classes and plans for the summer. He was studying engineering, which Lisa loved to boast about every chance she got. He had a charm about him, an easy way of talking that made me feel comfortable, even when I noticed his gaze lingered on me a little too long. "So, how's Dan?" he asked, leaning against the counter, his tone casual. I hesitated for a moment before responding. "He's good. Busy as always. You know how he is." Jake nodded, a knowing look crossing his face. "Still working late all the time?" "Pretty much," I admitted, trying not to let the bitterness seep into my voice. "It's part of the job, I guess." There was a pause, the kind that felt heavier than it should have. I busied myself with arranging the sandwiches on a plate, avoiding his eyes. "You deserve better, you know," he said softly. The words caught me off guard. I looked up, meeting his gaze. His expression was sincere, almost too much so. I forced a laugh, brushing it off. "It's not that simple, Jake. Marriage isn't perfect, but it's stable." Stable doesn't sound like happy," he countered, his voice gentle but firm. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. Instead, I handed him a plate and changed the subject, asking about his summer plans. He went along with it, but the conversation lingered in my mind longer than I wanted it to. After lunch, we settled in the living room. Jake sprawled out on the couch while I tidied up. The TV droned in the background, but I barely registered it. My thoughts were elsewhere, circling back to his words. "You deserve better." It was an innocent comment, wasn't it? Or was it? I shook my head, chastising myself for overthinking. Jake was just being sweet, thoughtful. That's how he was. It didn't mean anything. But when I glanced over at him, his eyes were already on me, and for a moment I felt my breath catch. "You okay?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "Yeah, just tired," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Long week." He nodded, his gaze softening. "You should take it easy. You do too much." I laughed lightly. "Now you sound like your mom." "She's not wrong," he said, sitting up straighter. "You're always putting everyone else first. When's the last time you did something for yourself?" His question struck a nerve. I hadn't even realized how much I'd been neglecting myself until he said it. Between taking care of the house, supporting Dan's career, and maintaining appearances, there wasn't much left for me. But again, I shrugged it off, not ready to unpack the weight of it all. The afternoon passed uneventfully, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. We talked, laughed, and even played a game of cards, just like old times. But there was an undercurrent to it all, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't until the sun began to set, casting the living room in a warm, golden glow, that I realized how comfortable I felt around him. Too comfortable, maybe. As Jake got up to grab a drink from the kitchen, I caught myself watching him, my eyes tracing the lines of his broad shoulders and the way he moved with an ease that was almost magnetic. I looked away quickly, my cheeks flushing with shame. What is wrong with me? I thought, shaking my head. He's just a kid I'd practically helped raise. When he returned, he sat closer to me than before, his knee brushing against mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt magnified in the quiet of the room. I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. My heart raced, and I hated myself for it. "You seem distracted," he said, his voice low. I forced a laugh, brushing it off. "Just tired, like I said." "You sure?" he pressed, his eyes searching mine. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. Positive, but I wasn't sure at all. As the evening settled in, I tried to focus on mundane tasks to keep my mind occupied, folding laundry, organizing the kitchen, and wiping down already clean counters. Jake was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, occasionally letting out a chuckle at whatever he was watching. His presence felt larger than life, an odd comfort mixed with a subtle tension I couldn't shake. "Do you always keep yourself this busy?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. I glanced at him over my shoulder, giving a wry smile. Old habits die hard. "You should relax," he said, sitting up and setting his phone aside. Uh, come sit with me, watch a movie or something." I hesitated. It was such a simple suggestion, but it felt loaded somehow. Maybe I was projecting, overanalyzing an innocent moment, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. "It's been a while since I've actually sat down to watch something," I admitted, walking over to the couch. I chose the far end, keeping a respectable distance, though the couch wasn't big enough to make it feel far enough. "What do you have in mind?" "Whatever you want," he replied, grabbing the remote. "I'm easy to please." The words hung in the air longer than they should have, or maybe I imagined it. I mentally shook myself, dismissing the thought. Jake flipped through streaming options, settling on a comedy we both liked, and soon the sound of laughter filled the room. For the first time all day, I felt the tension ease, at least momentarily. As the movie played, I found myself getting drawn into the storyline, letting my guard down. Jake seemed genuinely engrossed, laughing at all the right moments, and I caught myself sneaking glances at him, marveling at how much he'd grown up. It was unsettling how different he seemed now, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself. There was an ease to him, a quiet confidence that seemed far beyond his years. Halfway through the movie, Jake shifted closer, his arm resting along the back of the couch. I stiffened slightly but said nothing, telling myself it was just a casual gesture. But then he turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine. "You've got such a serious look on your face," he said softly. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I laughed nervously, brushing off the question. "Nothing. Just tired, like I said earlier." "You've been saying that all day," he replied, his tone teasing but with an undercurrent of concern. "You're allowed to take a break, you know. Let someone else take care of things for a change." His words made my chest tighten. It wasn't something I heard often, if ever. Dan rarely said things like that, too caught up in his own world of work and social obligations. Jake's attention felt different. It wasn't just polite, it was intentional, deliberate, and that scared me. "I'm fine, really," I said, trying to steer the conversation away. "But thanks." Jake studied me for a moment longer before nodding, his gaze softening. He leaned back, his arms still draped casually along the couch, and turned his attention back to the screen. I tried to focus on the movie, but my thoughts were a tangled mess. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and I was hyper-aware of every movement he made. When the credits rolled, Jake stretched, his shirt riding up slightly to reveal a sliver of skin. I looked away quickly, feeling ridiculous for even noticing. He stood and headed toward the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. "You want something to drink?" he called out. "Sure," I replied, grateful for the distraction. He returned with 2 glasses, handing one to me before sitting down again, this time closer than before. Our knees nearly touched, and I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I sipped my water, hoping it would cool the heat creeping up my neck. "Do you ever get lonely?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but steady. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the glass in his hands. "I just mean, with Dan always working and stuff, do you ever feel like you're alone, even when you're not?" The honesty in his voice startled me. It wasn't the kind of question I expected from him, or anyone for that matter. It was too raw, too close to the truth I avoided admitting even to myself. "Sometimes," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But that's just how life is, I guess." "It doesn't have to be," he replied, looking at me intently. There it was again, that sincerity, that unspoken something lingering between us. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, focusing instead on the way the ice clinked against my glass as I swirled it. Jake set his glass down on the coffee table and leaned back, his eyes never leaving mine. "You know, you're pretty amazing," he said, his tone earnest. "I mean it. You do so much for everyone around you, but I don't think anyone tells you that enough." My breath hitched, and I felt a lump form in my throat. It had been so long since anyone had said something like that to me, so long since I felt truly seen. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice shaky. He smiled, and for a moment the tension melted away. It was just Jake, kind, thoughtful Jake, who had always been like family. But then he shifted closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the remote. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back instinctively. "Sorry," he said quickly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Regret? Embarrassment? Didn't mean to..." It's fine, I said, cutting him off, my voice higher than usual. Really? The room fell silent, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between us. I stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between us. I should get started on dinner, I said, heading toward the kitchen. Do you like pasta? Sure, he replied, his tone careful. As I busied myself with boiling water and chopping vegetables, I tried to push the moment out of my mind. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the way his words lingered in my head, or the way my heart raced when he was near. The kitchen felt like a sanctuary, the hum of the stove and the rhythmic chop of the knife grounding me. Jake's presence in the next room still weighed heavily on my mind. I could hear the faint sound of the TV, but I knew he wasn't paying attention. Neither was I. As I stirred the sauce, the click of his footsteps on the hardwood floor made my pulse quicken. He appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed casually. His presence filled the small kitchen in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. "Smells good in here," he said, his voice warm but carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. "Just a simple pasta," I replied, keeping my eyes on the stovetop. "Nothing fancy." "You don't give yourself enough credit," he said, stepping closer. He was standing beside me now, peering over my shoulder. "Looks amazing." The heat from the stove was nothing compared to the warmth radiating from him. I stepped aside slightly, needing space, but he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he chose not to. "Can I help with anything?" he asked, his tone almost teasing. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, my voice more abrupt than I intended. I forced a smile, trying to lighten the moment. "You're the guest. Go relax." He didn't move. Instead, he reached over to grab a spoon, dipping it into the sauce without asking. He tasted it, nodding appreciatively. "Perfect," he said, his smile disarming. "You're really good at this." "It's just pasta," I replied, my voice tight. "You're too modest," he said, setting the spoon down. "You're good at so much more than you realize." I froze, unsure of how to respond. The weight of his words hung in the air, making the small kitchen feel even smaller. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, the intensity of his gaze made my breath catch. "Jake," I started, but he interrupted me. "You work so hard to make everyone happy," he said softly. "When was the last time someone did that for you?" The question felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he said them, so full of sincerity and something else I couldn't or didn't want to name. I looked away, focusing on the stove as if it held the answers I needed. "Let's not do this," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do what?" he asked, stepping closer. His tone was gentle, almost coaxing. "This," I said, gesturing vaguely between us. "Whatever this is." He didn't reply immediately, and the silence felt deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I'm sorry if I'm making you uncomfortable," he said. "That's the last thing I want." "It's not that," I said quickly, my words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It's just, you're my best friend's son, Jake. This isn't, appropriate." He stepped back slightly, giving me space, but his expression didn't change. If anything, he looked even more determined. "I know how it sounds," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm not a kid anymore, and I see you, you know? I see how much you give to everyone else, how much you hold yourself back. You deserve to feel appreciated." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I turned off the stove, needing to focus on something, anything, but him. My hands were shaking slightly as I plated the pasta, and I hated that he noticed. "Dinner's ready," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's eat." We sat at the dining table, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Jake tried to make conversation, asking about my plans for the summer, but my answers were clipped, my focus entirely on the food in front of me. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. After dinner, I excused myself to clean up, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. The clatter of dishes in the sink was almost soothing, a distraction from the whirlwind of emotions I couldn't seem to control. But then Jake appeared in the kitchen again, this time standing closer than before. "Let me help," he said, reaching for a dish towel. I've got it," I said, not looking at him. "I know you do," he replied, his voice soft, "but I want to." There it was again, that sincerity, that determination to be involved in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. I handed him a plate, keeping my eyes on the sink, but I could feel his presence beside me, close enough to brush against me if either of us moved even slightly. "Why are you doing this?" I asked finally, my voice barely audible. "Doing what?" he asked, his tone careful. This," I said, turning to face him, acting like like this is okay. "Because I care about you," he said simply, his eyes locking onto mine, "and I think you deserve to feel that from someone." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "You don't understand. It can't happen." "Why not?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Because you're married? Because I'm younger? Because you're afraid of what people will think?" "Yes," I said, my voice cracking, "all of it." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back instinctively. "Jake, stop," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't fair." "Fair to who?" he asked, his tone gentle but unyielding. "To Dan? To my mom? What about you? When's the last time you thought about what you want?" I can't," I whispered, shaking my head. I can't. The silence that followed was deafening. He stepped back, giving me the space I so desperately needed, but the intensity in his eyes didn't waver. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I nodded, unable to speak. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the weight of everything unsaid. My hands gripped the edge of the counter, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I didn't know how to feel, what to think. All I knew was that something had shifted, and there was no going back. The house felt quieter after Jake left the kitchen, but the air was still thick with tension. I tried to focus on cleaning up, scrubbing the counters with more force than necessary, as if erasing the physical mess could somehow tidy up the chaos in my head. But it didn't work. No matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, they lingered, creeping back in the silence. I turned off the lights in the kitchen, deciding it was time to retreat to the safety of my room. Jake had gone back to the living room, the glow of the TV flickering against the walls. I didn't look in his direction as I passed by, though I could feel his eyes following me. "Good night," I said, my voice strained. "Good night," he replied, his tone soft, almost hesitant. I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp on my bedside table. I changed into a pair of loose pajamas, hoping the comfort of the familiar fabric would calm my nerves. But as I climbed into bed, the weight of the day pressed down on me, making it impossible to relax. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Jake's words replayed in my mind, over and over. When's the last time you thought about what you want? The question had felt like a dagger, piercing through the walls I'd built around myself. He wasn't wrong. I couldn't remember the last time I'd considered my own happiness, let alone acted on it. My life had become a series of routines, a relentless pursuit of stability at the expense of everything else. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. It didn't matter what Jake was offering. Whatever it was, wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was a momentary distraction, a fleeting connection that would only lead to disaster. I couldn't let myself go down that road. A soft knock on the door startled me. My heart raced as I sat up, staring at the handle as if it might move on its own. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling. "It's me," Jake replied, his voice muffled through the door. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to tell him to go away. But instead, I found myself standing, my feet moving toward the door as if they had a mind of their own. I opened it just a crack, enough to see his face. He looked nervous, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. It's late," I said, glancing at the clock. We should both get some sleep." "Please," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Just for a minute." I hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small room. I closed the door behind him, my stomach twisting into knots. He stood in the middle of the room, his gaze shifting around as if he didn't know where to start. "What is it?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable around me," he said finally. "I know I said some things earlier that might have crossed a line, and I'm sorry if I made you feel, pressured." "You didn't," I said quickly, though it wasn't entirely true. "It's just complicated." "I know," he said, nodding, "but I don't want to make things harder for you. I care about you, and the last thing I want is to hurt you." His sincerity caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as we stood there in silence. He took a step closer, and I didn't move away. "Jake," I started, but he interrupted me. "I just need you to know something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to be happy, and if there's anything I can do to help you see that, I will." Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "This can't happen," I said, my voice shaky. "I know," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, "but that doesn't change how I feel." He reached up, his hand cupping my cheek. The warmth of his touch made my breath catch, and for a moment I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. He leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from mine, and I froze. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice so soft it was almost a plea. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to end this before it went any further, but my body betrayed me, rooted in place, unable to move. And then, before I could stop it, his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was testing the waters, but when I didn't pull away, he deepened it, his hands sliding to my waist, pulling me closer. I felt my resolve slipping, the walls I'd built around myself crumbling under the weight of his touch. "Jake, we can't," I whispered, breaking the kiss, though I didn't move out of his arms. "I know," he said, his forehead resting against mine, "but I don't regret it." They moved to Rome. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I stepped back, putting some distance between us. "You should go." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry if I crossed a line. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." I didn't respond, my throat too tight to speak. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him, and I sank onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name. The weight of what had just happened settled over me, and I knew there was no going back. The line had been crossed, and no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, everything had changed. The next morning, I woke with a heavy weight on my chest. The events of the previous night played on an endless loop in my mind, each moment laced with guilt and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling of Jake's hands on my waist, his lips on mine, or the way my body had betrayed me by not pulling away sooner. The worst part was that I didn't know what to do now. Pretend nothing happened? Confront him? Confide in someone? The options all felt impossible. I stayed in bed longer than usual, hoping to delay the inevitable awkwardness of seeing Jake, but the sound of movement downstairs eventually forced me to get up. I threw on a robe and tied it tightly around my waist, as if the extra barrier would somehow shield me from the tension that awaited. When I walked into the kitchen, Jake was already there, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He glanced up as I entered, his face unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice cautious. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I avoided looking directly at him as I poured myself a cup of coffee, focusing on the steam rising from the mug as if it held all the answers. The silence between us was unbearable. Finally, Jake broke it. "About last night," he started, his voice hesitant. "Don't," I interrupted, setting my cup down with more force than I intended. "Let's not talk about it. We can't just pretend it didn't happen," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I don't want things to be weird between us." "Well, they are," I snapped, immediately regretting the sharpness of my tone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Look, Jake, I know you meant well, but what happened last night was a mistake. It can't happen again." He nodded slowly, his expression somber. "I understand. I hope you know how much I care about you." "I do," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "But this has to stop, for both our sakes." The rest of the morning passed in stilted conversation and forced politeness. Jake tried to act normal, making jokes and talking about his plans for the day, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought I wasn't looking. I hated the way my heart ached for him, even as I knew I had to keep my distance. Later that afternoon, Lisa called to check in. Her voice was bright and cheerful, completely oblivious to the turmoil brewing in my house. "How's everything going?" she asked. "Jake behaving himself?" Of course, I said, forcing a laugh. He's been great, no trouble at all. Good, she said, her tone warm. I was worried he might drive you crazy with his constant snacking and endless questions about life. I smiled weakly, though she couldn't see it. Nope, he's been a perfect guest. We chatted for a few more minutes before she hung up, leaving me feeling even worse than before. Lying to her felt like a betrayal, but the truth was unthinkable. How could I ever explain what had happened? How could I risk losing her friendship, her trust? The day dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Jake spent most of the afternoon in the living room, scrolling through his phone and pretending to watch TV, while I busied myself with cleaning and organizing, anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. As the sun began to set, Jake approached me in the hallway, his expression hesitant. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "I'm fine," I said quickly, brushing past him, but he caught my arm, stopping me in my tracks. "Are we okay?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "We will be," I said finally, pulling my arm free. "We just need some time." He nodded, stepping back to let me pass. I retreated to my room, closing the door behind me and sinking onto the bed. My heart felt heavy, weighed down by the enormity of what had happened and the uncertainty of what would come next. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts raced. I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't, but I didn't know how to fix it, how to make things right without causing even more damage. The next morning, I resolved to put some distance between us. I offered to drop Jake off at his house, explaining that I had errands to run and wouldn't be around much for the rest of the weekend. He agreed without protest, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. The drive to his house was quiet, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. When we arrived, he turned to me, his expression conflicted. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, his voice sincere, "and for everything else." "You're welcome," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Take care, Jake." He nodded, hesitating for a moment before getting out of the car. I watched him walk up the driveway, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to look away, driving off before I could second-guess my decision. Back at home, the house felt eerily quiet without him. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt a strange emptiness, as if a part of me had been left behind. I tried to fill the void with chores and distractions, but nothing seemed to work. Over the next few days, I avoided Lisa's calls, unable to face her without feeling like a fraud. I told myself I needed time, space, to figure out what to do, but deep down, I knew I was running away from the truth. When Lisa finally showed up at my door unannounced, I panicked. She was all smiles, carrying a bottle of wine and chatting about her trip, but I couldn't shake the gnawing guilt in my stomach. "Jake said he had a great time with you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "Thank you so much for looking after him." "Oh, it was no trouble," I said, forcing a smile. "He's a good kid." "Kid," she repeated, laughing. "He's hardly a kid anymore, though, is he? He's grown up so much." I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, he has." Lisa didn't notice my discomfort, too caught up in recounting the details of her trip, but I couldn't focus on her words. All I could think about was the fragile balance I was trying to maintain, the lies I was telling to keep the peace. As she left that evening, hugging me tightly and thanking me again, I felt like a house of cards on the verge of collapse. The truth was too big, too messy to contain forever. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. The days after Lisa's visit passed in a haze of guilt and dread. I avoided her calls, afraid of what I might say if pressed. Jake remained distant, a quiet absence that left a strange void in the house. The weight of what had happened grew heavier, pressing down on me until I could barely function. One evening, Lisa called unexpectedly. My heart sank as her name lit up the screen, but I answered, trying to sound normal. "Hi, Lisa." Her voice was cheerful, oblivious. "Hey, I've been meaning to check in. Jake said he had a great time staying with you. Thank you for looking after him." The words made my stomach churn. Of course, he's a great kid." "No, no kid anymore," she laughed. "It's amazing how much he's grown up." Her words hit harder than they should have, and I barely managed to keep the conversation going. When she finally hung up, I sat in silence, the guilt festering like an open wound. A week later, Lisa appeared at my door unannounced, Jake trailing behind her. My breath caught as I saw them standing there. "Surprise," she said, beaming. "We thought we'd drop by for coffee." I forced a smile, letting them in. Jake avoided my gaze, and the tension was suffocating. Lisa, oblivious, filled the air with chatter as I busied myself in the kitchen, but every glance Jake sent my way felt like a spark to dry kindling. As Lisa stepped away to take a call, Jake finally spoke. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said sharply, my hands trembling. "It's over, Jake. It never should have happened." He frowned, his voice low. "I know you feel something. Don't deny it." "Stop," I hissed. "For your mom's sake. For mine." Lisa reappeared, her cheerful tone cutting through the tension. "Everything okay in here?" "Perfect," I said, plastering on a smile. But it wasn't. That night, I texted Lisa, "We need to talk. It's about Jake." She came over the next day, her concern palpable. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "Something happened while Jake stayed here." Her face darkened. What do you mean?" I struggled to explain, confessing the truth in fragmented sentences. Her shock quickly turned to fury. "You let this happen?" she spat. "You betrayed me." Tears streamed down my face. "I didn't mean to. I don't want to hear it," she snapped, storming out and slamming the door. The fallout was swift and merciless. Lisa cut me off completely, the severed friendship leaving an ache I couldn't soothe. Rumors spread among our circle of friends, and I became a pariah. Jake stayed silent, a shadow of the connection we once shared. My marriage to Dan continued, but it was a hollow shell, the unspoken truth creating an unbridgeable chasm. In the end, I was left alone to face the wreckage, a lesson in the cost of crossing a line that could never be undone.